So, what would happen if the Persian Gulf was closed? What would happen if a lot of those wellheads over there in the Middle East were set afire? Let's get into that this week in oil. Hey, I'm Aaron Kildow with 30 years of experience in oil trading and analytics, and I'm here to elevate your understanding of the oil markets. So, I wanted to bring this to you real quick. I don't have a big PowerPoint this week. It's just stuff I've been thinking about over the past few days. Today's the 19th of June. Iran started bombing, Israel started bombing Iran on the 12th of June. So we've had a couple days to, think about this situation. There's the possibility that the US would join in to this situation and maybe start bombing Iran, start bombing some of their nuclear facilities or facilities where they're upgrading uranium to potentially have some sort of nuclear weapon. We've talked a lot on this channel about the closure of the Persian Gulf, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. A viewer brought up the possibility of what if they go scorched earth, like what happened after Saddam removed his forces from Kuwait in 1991. They set a bunch of oil. They set a bunch of oil wells on fire on their way out the door. So, what would happen in this current situation if something like that were to happen again? So there's a couple things I've been thinking about, but it keeps coming back to me that it's probably from a US perspective, more of a credit event. So let me explain that to you. Let me walk you through what I'm thinking from that standpoint. First of all, we're net exporters in crude. Maybe I should say we're net exporters of liquid oil. We export a ton of LNGs, liquefied natural gas. We export a bunch of NGLs, natural gas liquids. We export a bunch of crude and products. Now, we do import crude. Most of our crude comes from Canada and Mexico, so we call that maybe from a North American perspective. We don't really import that much crude outside of North America, if you will. The crude that we do import is typically heavy and medium grades. We've got enough of the light sweet crudes that we don't need any more of that. We're producing enough of it on our own. So that puts us in an interesting dilemma. In other words, on paper, from a really high level, we don't need the crude from the Middle East, but the market is so woven together, so interlinked, that a shortage in Asia, because they're not getting the crude they'd normally get from the Middle East, becomes a big issue or a price problem here in the US and the rest of the Western countries. And of course, we would try to increase production, we try to increase exports to try to help meet that need. But in the meantime, prices are going to go crazy. So just as a thought experiment, thinking about what if they do hit $300 per barrel? We're currently around $75 per barrel, at least on the futures. Yesterday, I think that's exactly where it settled. And so that's 75 to 300, $225 increase, 300% increase. That gives us maybe something to start with. So what I wanted to bring up first, maybe is just to set the stage a little bit. As I mentioned, in 1991, Saddam's forces went into Kuwait. The U.S. and others went in to go push them out. And as we pushed out those forces, they set a bunch of wells on fire. And maybe you remember this, maybe something you could Google to see those images. It was really quite something to see. So from what I can tell, again, I'm remembering some of this and I've done some research as well. There's about 650 wellheads set on fire. A company called Bechtel, which shout out to you guys. I know you guys watch this. A company called Bechtel went in and worked with other folks like Red Adair to put out those fires. And it took them 9 months to do it. So that's 2 to 3 wells per day sort of thing. At the time, Kuwait was producing about 2 million barrels per day. Demand in 1991 was somewhere around 67 million barrels per day. So you're talking about 2% or so of the global demand was taken out for that time period. But we're talking billions of barrels that were just set ablaze. And I believe, from at least from what I read and pictures I've seen, it's been a while, but it looks like the countryside, the desert there is permanently scarred from these fires, from all this mess. So maybe if you're there and you know differently, please let us know in the comments or send pictures. But it, outside of being a massive environmental disaster, it was also a disaster for the country of Kuwait. Now, fast forward to 2007, 2008, and we had, the run up in crude prices. We had gone from sort of $50, $60 up to $140 in 2007. Things started getting a little bit weird in 2008. You could tell from, credit was getting pinched. And then by September of 2008, we had Lehman finally going under. And that was a sort of a crazy time to be alive, to be trading in the markets, because things started to be driven by credit. And that was a very weird sensation. At that time, I was working for a company that was fairly cash rich, but small in the big scheme of things in terms of sort of international trade and that sort of thing. We were just a domestic facing company, if you will. We were moving crude oil. We were moving a lot of diesel fuel at that time. That was our primary thing, is diesel fuel. We were just getting into well, maybe that even preceded that. I was going to say we're just getting into RINs and sort of biodiesel and that sort of thing too, but that would have been the really early days of that. At any rate, it stands out still in my mind, all the different credit things that would happen. And I'm going to go through that here in a minute. Um, but I guess let's go ahead and jump into what I think would happen if prices went from $75 per barrel on crude to $300 per barrel. And again, just to put that in a frame of reference, because that's hard to sort of, we've never been that high, right? $300 per barrel works out to $7.15, $7.14 per gallon. So just from like a wholesale price, if gasoline was the same price as crude oil, you'd be looking at $7.14 per gallon, but that's before any of taxes and any of that sort of thing. Maybe a better way to look at it would be a 300% increase in price, which would put, from recent retail prices, which would put us closer to $9.75 or so. So call it $9 to $10 per gallon at the pump if things sort of stayed the way they are, which they might not necessarily do. But just to put it in some sort of context for you, that's sort of what we're looking at as being a possibility, and not just in California, but nationwide. California would actually be even higher. Again, assuming the relationships we're seeing now between crude and products stayed the same, which isn't necessarily true, but it's a place to start. So one of the first things to think about is the futures market. So people put on hedges. And again, so maybe a small crude producer would go to one of the banks to put on a crude hedge. They'd use an ISDA type agreement. So they'd have a bilateral agreement with the bank. And that's one set of credit that we'll come back to here in a second. But it's a credit relationship, basically, that governs that ISDA agreement. What I'm a little more concerned about is when you have shorts on the exchange, that you'd get a margin call, right? So if we went from, T-1 at $75 per barrel, and then on the day where whatever it is bad that happens, and crude oil suddenly spikes to $300 per barrel, a 300% increase. The next day, or depending on when it happens, even during that day, there would be massive margin calls coming from the exchange, from the NYMEX, from the CME. And I recall, again, just to kind of put this in perspective, I recall one time shortly after Enron collapsed, I was in New York working for a big brokerage shop, and we had a huge client. I'm not going to say the name, even though it's 25 years ago almost. A huge client who had this short position on, and the same sort of thing happened. The market spiked, and we called them for a margin call. And I believe, now this is again thinking back, and it probably doesn't matter because I'm not going to tell you who it was, but it was something like $25 million that we had to have by the end of business that day in cash because there was a huge margin call because the market had moved against them in such a violent way. And so all of us in the office were, it was a very stressful day hoping that this client could come up with $25 million in cash in 2001. And they did. They eventually did, and everything was fine. But then it starts to get you thinking, well, what would happen if they didn't have that money? And the way that the FCMs are set up, the futures clearing merchants are set up, is such that you have daily margin calls that the FCM, so your clearinghouse, has to meet to go to the exchange. Whoever was on the right side of that trade, whoever, and it could be, several different people making a composite of that trade, but whoever was on the correct side of that trade wanted their $25 million, understandably. Let's say the market shot up, they were long going into that situation. They sold at the top, they want their $25 million because, hey, who wouldn't? For, a day's trade or however, I think it was a day's trade, just the way the market moved against them. So somebody had to pay that $25 million. It comes from somewhere, right? And so what the exchange did is they would go to the FCMs and say, well, you've got clients with these positions on, they need to pay, and it's a 1-for-1 margin, and it's up to the FCM to go sort of collect that. So sometimes the FCM will get into agreements where they'll say, for you're such a good client and you're a big, beautiful company and we believe in what you're doing, the first $1 million of any daily margin call will cover that for you. Don't worry about it. But above and beyond that, we're going to call you up and say, you owe us XYZ. So, if you got a $25 million margin call, that's something, completely different outside the bounds of that. And again, the FCM might cover the first $1 million, but you've got to come up with $24 million, something like that. The point I'm telling you about this is the way it's structured. If an FCM misses that margin call, then the whole thing starts to fall like a house of cards. The whole exchange starts to fall like a house of cards. So if you think about it, there are, and just look at the futures, the open interest on the market, there are shorts out, all these different contracts. I tend to, right now, again, it's June of 2025. I tend to like to look at Cal 26 as an indicator of what's going on in the hedging community, what different crude producers should be hedging and that sort of thing. And yeah, after Israel started launching missiles and bombs at Iran, the market really shot up. Cal 26 really shot up. Volume is up. Open interest is up. So yes, there's hedging going on in that space. I've spoken to friends in the market, and yes, there's absolutely hedging going on that's hitting the exchange, right? There's this bilateral stuff on ISDA that's getting done, but there's also stuff on the exchange getting done. So that's a major risk right off the bat. If there's a big enough price spike, and again, there's things that can be done on the exchange itself to sort of shut down the market, circuit breakers to keep it from going, but they can only do that for so long until the market catches up with reality. So if something were to happen, like the Strait of Hormuz was shut for a period of time, if you had a massive amount of wells set on fire in the Middle East or something like this, something catastrophic, that could be enough to topple the NYMEX. Just again, depending on how long people think that would last, how bad the event was, that sort of thing. So then the second thing I mentioned is these bilateral agreements. So a lot of them are in ISDA type form. And those are, again, going to define that credit relationship between the two customers. What sort of tenor can you have? How far out in the future are we willing to work with you on hedging products? And again, I'm speaking now from more of a bank experience, a banking side experience I've had, where working for the bank that gives out ISDAs to its clients to be able to trade, to be able to hedge. Primarily hedging is what I'm thinking in this part of the discussion. So for someone like a crude producer, it probably wouldn't be a margin call type relationship. If you had reserve-based loans, it's actually a good thing that crude prices go up and you're a crude producer, right? So you probably wouldn't have that same sort of margin call on a crude producer as long as that is done on an ISDA. Again, that is going to depend agreement by agreement, company to company. As a whole, I think that's probably right, at least with the banks. But then the problem becomes, if you're a small crude producer, who are you going to sell tomorrow's crude to? So you would probably have some barrels contracted up. Maybe you contracted to a major, maybe you're contracted to a marketing company, that sort of thing. But the next marginal barrel that you can sell, who you got to sell that to? And again, just my train of thought would say, well, someone like an Exxon, an integrated, one of these big integrated super majors, probably an okay credit risk at this point in time. Again, saying something just happened in the Middle East, something catastrophic where a large portion of the world's crude oil has been cut off for some period of time, more than just a day. So selling to a super major is probably an okay credit risk, but I guarantee your credit manager is coming to you, to the marketing guys, going, wait a minute, do we really need to be selling to the marketing company? So again, the marketing company is just sort of gathering up barrels and they're turning around and trying to sell it to the best bidder, be that a refiner, maybe another marketing company, maybe someone looking to put crude into storage, which there wouldn't be anyone. That's going to be one of the points coming up. Nobody's going to want to put anything into storage at that point. But then the point is you have to sort of pick and choose who's your best credit relationship from that standpoint. Who's going to be able to actually pay you for that barrel? So in the crude oil world, especially in the US crude oil world, the credit terms can get crazy because sometimes you're 50 days out from getting paid. So in other words, you start pumping crude oil at the beginning of June and you might not get paid until the end of July or the late July, that sort of thing, for that crude, depending on how long the pipeline takes to get there. Other concerns, that sort of thing. Again, it depends how that contract is worded and everything like that. But so there's some really big credit envelopes out there, or credit that's given to various customers out there, that you could see that shrink very quickly if you increase the price of crude by 300%, if that makes sense. And so what I'm saying is usually those credit limits are talked about in terms of dollars. So you would have a some sort of limit, and I did put some numbers around this. So just as an example, let's say you had a deal to do like a one a day type deal. So 365, so that'd be 1,000 barrels per day for Cal 26. So let's call that 365,000 barrels, rounding up a little bit, at $67, which is roughly around where Cal 26 is today. That's a value of, say, $24.4 million. Again, 365,000 barrels times $67, just multiplying that through. If we increase that price to $267 because the front end of crude has gone up 300%, not necessarily the forward curve, but the front end has gone up to $300. $267 is, I don't think, a stretch. At any rate, that's worth $97 million now. So you've gone from 24.4 to $97.5 million, increase in $73 million in the value of that potential hedge. So again, getting back to, if you were short and you were hedging that, the crude producer is long crude in the ground, they're short the hedge because they're trying to lock in those prices. If you were short from a flat price perspective, that's an increase of $73 million. So that could probably eat up your credit lines pretty quickly. And they couldn't. So again, from an ISDA standpoint, maybe that's okay, because again, from a bank's perspective, it's good that's crude gone up, the price of crude has gone up. They're going to be able to repay you, but your existing credit line may be completely wiped out, and you can't take on any more new trades, at least initially, to be able to talk to your credit people, because the trade that yesterday took up $24 million in credit has now taken up $97 million in credit and potentially exhausted that whole credit line just by that move. So again, talking to the bank credit person probably would approve a bigger line, I would imagine. For some of these other things, maybe not, that we'll get into. But so just to sort of give you an idea of how fast these things add up, selling one a day is not very much, right? That's sort of the bare minimum of, sort of your typical trades that you would see from bank side flow coming from the producers. That's really a pretty small amount in the big scheme of things. So the other thing, again, I was thinking about is you would have credit term solutions. Like I was saying, sometimes you get 50 days of credit in the oil market. Sometimes, again, from a banking perspective, we would try to step into the middle of that, either as a credit sleeve to help someone get paid a little bit faster. Maybe we would say, again, it's all totally hypothetical, not based on any actual deals or anything like that. But so just hypothetically, customer A walks in, they've got the existing credit is 50 days after first sale, and they want to try to shorten that up. So we might step in there as a bank and say, okay, we'll pay you 10 days after, but we take on that risk then with the other client. So now we're on the hook for 40 days, right, of sort of non-payment. And there's different ways the bank can handle that to finance that and to charge the client to sort of recuperate some of that. But to the extent that goes on, and it does go on, that's obviously another big risk that just opened up if against in the scenario where something bad happens in the Middle East. Just tightening up credit lines very quickly. There's also the cost of carry, right? As we mentioned, right now the front spread is worth $1.64 in contango. So if you what that means is if you have a barrel of oil in storage today and you decided to hold it till next month, you would actually lose $1.64 just on the shape of the market. So the market's telling you that barrel is worth $1.64 more today than it would be at the end of next month. So that's just doesn't make a lot of sense for you to hold any more barrels than you need to. It's called backwardation. It's sort of the state we've been in here for quite a while. But again, if you were to, there are reasons you want to hold oil in tankage. Again, if you're running a blending operation, if you're setting up pre-storage or storage for a refinery, you probably think about it a different way. But at some point, somebody has to go through the math and say, what is the cost of me buying this incremental barrel and putting it in storage and that sort of thing? And so again, that goes way up. I sort of ran some calculations on that. And at the end of the day, the cost of doing business, of holding any extra oil that you wouldn't need to, goes up by about 266%. So why would anybody want to hold oil if they absolutely didn't have to, which we'll circle back to that again here in a second. So the original scenario is oil shoots up to $300. Maybe it doesn't stay there because people are trying to get out of storage and liquidate everything they have in tank at $300 per barrel. That, again, from a refining perspective, that even might be worth more selling that, trying to sell that barrel of crude oil at $300 than it would be to try to refine it and then try to find customers to pay for the refined product. That's kind of how crazy these sort of things could get pretty quickly. Um, so from the crude oil world perspective, you have to find sort of the right buyer, the buyer that you can work with, the buyer that your credit folks are okay to work with. Um, so you're probably looking at super majors. You're looking at maybe government-based contracts. So if you've got a deal where you're selling jet fuel to the government, you're probably okay for a while. Again, it depends on how long this sort of thing goes on for. But selling to an independent gasoline station, that's a whole different ball of wax. Right. So again, maybe you don't know this, but gasoline stations don't make a whole lot of money on a day-to-day basis from the sale of gasoline and diesel fuel. They make money from selling, drinks and food and that sort of thing inside. If markets are moving a lot, if there's enough volatility, the market goes up. They can sort of try to match the move up in price, and then the market drops down really quickly. They keep their prices high, and for those few days, or maybe it's a week, where they can keep prices high at the pump, but their cost to resupply has been falling day after day. That's where they make money on gasoline. That's where they make money on diesel fuel. If the market is just simply going up and staying there, that is a disaster for your average retail gas station, right? There's not, and especially if you're talking about going from $3.25 to almost $10, there's not enough Twinkies that you can sell to make up for that. Because remember, the gas station usually has very tight credit terms as well. So there's where they got to come up with the cash to buy $10 per gallon gas when yesterday they were selling it for $3.25, right? So there's some huge issues just in that. And of course, now we get to the end user. I know my driving habits would completely change, right? At $9.75 per gasoline. Maybe companies start going back to the work from home model by and large. Of course, there's people, there's hospital staff, there's policemen, there's firemen that we need them to be at work, and we need to figure out how to make sure there's gasoline and diesel fuel for them to do their jobs correctly. Somebody's going to have to pay for that somewhere along the line. You can also think about travel by airplane, because again, jet fuel prices would have to go up as well. If you're traveling internationally, it depends where you go, but what sort of certainty is there when you get there that there will be the ability to leave the airport, the ability to get from the airport to your hotel? Again, just from a credit perspective, from just the price of everything going up, maybe you end up paying through the nose for your Uber to go from the airport to the hotel. But again, so I want you to try to think of these cascading effects of something like this going on. So again, just things that are kind of been going through my head. If the end users really slow down, and especially from a US perspective, gasoline would really slow down, especially if we go back to that work from home model again. Diesel fuel, maybe not so much in this instance, on this part of the discussion, probably looking at 2020 at the COVID years, might not be a bad idea, where diesel demand stayed relatively steady, but gasoline demand just fell off a cliff, that sort of thing. So refining margins would get crushed. And again, so refining margins, you got in terms of credit, in terms of when they pay for the crude versus how fast they get paid back for the refined product, typically is pretty good, meaning that the refiner gets paid from the stuff that they process faster than they have to pay out the barrel of crude oil. Again, it depends completely on where they are, how they're set up, how far away they are from centers of production, meaning crude oil, where is it extracted from the ground that they're running, that sort of thing. Generally, there's a pretty good cash flow situation going on there. But if your end user demand drops drastically, that's going to hit refining margins, which is going to make it harder for them to buy $300 crude and that sort of thing. So again, it sort of would strike me that maybe initially the market spikes up in a reaction. $300, I don't think, again, is crazy. Going back to 1991, we were, say, $15 per barrel, $16 per barrel before the whole Saddam in Kuwait and them burning all those wellheads. The market basically doubled, went up to $30, $35, depending if you're looking at WTI or Brent. So to say crude oil would go from 75 to 300, an increase of 300%, is not crazy in my estimation. But then the question is, okay, but for how long? And that sort of loops back into where we started the conversation. From a credit perspective, things would tighten up very quickly in terms of how the at least the US crude oil market operates, right? So I think even if we did spike up to $300, as long as as long as whatever hostility is contained to the Middle East and is not a direct threat to, say, the US or continental Europe, prices would probably start to come back down a little bit, especially in the US, because we're more isolated in terms of being a net exporter. At least we'd still be a bit of an importer on crude even outside of North America, but we can sort of work with that. The problem, of course, is that crude supplies are already pretty tight in the US. So if we did ramp up exports, let's say we're doing 3.5 to 3.8 million barrels per day right now on exports, we could pick that up to maybe 7 million barrels per day, 6 million barrels per day, something like that, which would deplete our inventories really quickly. There are strategic reserves, both in the US and Europe and in Asia, at least in China, that would maybe help mitigate some of this. I think you'd still get that initial pop, and then the market would have to work its way back lower to find what actual demand was based on that new price setting. And I think that's probably what it all sort of comes down to at the end of the day, is finding out where that new supply and demand balance meets. And that's, again, for our website, you can see, the oil balance, our supply and demand crosses. That's what our whole logo is for the oil balance. But it's an interesting thought experiment. I hope we don't have to actually prove it out and go through it. It would be, devastating, but I just want you to think about maybe how that would play out if it were to happen. Again, my thought right now is it'd be more of a credit thing, and maybe looking back at 2007, 2008, when the credit markets completely tightened up for a totally different reason and sort of impacted the oil markets. I think you could make the argument that this would go the other direction, that the oil markets would impact overall credit markets, soaking up too much in terms of credit lines and, forcing all sorts. Again, it depends how long it goes on for. It could force all sorts of businesses into bankruptcy. And then you're dealing with, a bunch of even more people looking for jobs, which would decrease your gasoline demand even more. And that sort of carries on from there. So, again, something to think about. How are you guys thinking about this? I'd be interested to hear if you put it in the comments. What would be the knock-on effects? It's one thing for us to say, crude's going to $300, it'll be terrible. But how does that actually play out? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to in this video. So hopefully it gives you something to think about. I'd love to hear your comments in the comments below. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. And again, please go to our website, theoilbalance.com. For more information, hit that button that says, I want to be on your distribution list, and I'll put you on our distribution list for our normal weekly report. So if there was an event in the Middle East that shut in the Strait of Hormuz, that shut in oil production from the Middle East, maybe set those oil wells on fire like Saddam did to Kuwait back in 91, the initial thing, the initial hurdle for the market in general to get over is one, the margin calls from the exchanges, assuming that prices shoot up. People have said $300 per barrel. That's a reasonable number in my estimation. Can people make margin calls? What are they going to have to do to meet those margin calls? What are they going to have to sell? Again, it's got to be a flash sale because you need that money today. That's how those exchange margin calls work. If we get past that hurdle, the next hurdle would be the Asian market, supplying the Asian market. So again, about 50% of all the oil that Asia runs, just again speaking in very general terms, comes through the Persian Gulf. So that's a huge trying to resupply them. China has a ton of oil and SPR. They could be able to weather this better than anyone else, but I don't think the smaller countries, Vietnam, Japan, Korea, I don't think they have very big strategic reserves. I might be wrong there. But they're going to have to try to deal with this. The other thing, we've been primarily talking about crude oil and products this whole time. But remember, NGLs are such a huge part of the Asian market where they turn that into plastics that make all sorts of things, across the board. That's going to have to be replaced too. So it's not just crude oil that comes from the Persian Gulf. It's also NGLs. It's also LNGs, liquefied natural gas. So it's this whole gamut of energy that typically goes all the way to Asia, and that's where they get most of their supply from. If you think about this from a OPEC spare capacity position, almost all their spare capacity that OPEC has is in the Persian Gulf. There is some production in Iraq, the northern Iraq, that they could turn back on with the right agreements that would bring close to 1 million barrels per day through Turkey out into the Mediterranean. Russia has spare capacity that you would have to renegotiate some of these deals that the world, primarily Europe and the US have on Russia because of the Ukraine war. Those would have to be renegotiated to bring more barrels back, but there's just no way to replace 14, 15, 16 million barrels per day that's coming out of the Persian Gulf at this point in time. So number one, you have to get past the market in general, the sort of global macroeconomic economy has to get past the shock to the exchanges on the margin calls. Second thing is make sure get past the hurdle of Asia having enough feed to make enough stuff to, sell to the rest of the world. Are those economies going to collapse before we can get more crude to them, or more NGLs or more natural gas to them? I think that's a fair question to ask. So this could really have catastrophic effects. Again, the China being the low cost provider for, widgets and all sorts of things, a lot of plastic based things, of course, given their huge NGL demand, but that could be just a huge source of inflation for the global economy, right? If your cheapest supplier up to this point is suddenly, 50% of their supply is wiped out in terms of energy. So, two big things the market has to survive. If that scenario comes to pass, hopefully it doesn't, and we don't get to find out how these things actually work out. But at any rate, hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe, like we said a minute ago, and please visit us at theoilbalance.com. Thank you. Bye.